Good morning and welcome to a special edition of First in Future. I'm Leslie Boney, Director of the Institute for Emerging Issues at NC State University, and we're really excited about today's topic, which is what can the state of North Carolina do about improving how law enforcement is carried out across race? We're focusing today on one of the possible responses, a new task force created by Governor Roy Cooper, the North Carolina Task Force for Racial Equity in Criminal Justice. We'd like to thank you for joining us today via Facebook Live and Zoom webinar as we talk about this critical topic. We'd ask you to use chat to share your opinions with us. We also know that you have a number of questions and you can use Q&A to ask those. I can say up front that we're not going to be able to get to all of your questions, but there are chances for you to be heard. In fact, immediately following this program, there's going to be a public comment period where you can share your opinions with the task force directly. And we'll share details with that as the program continues. Basically, you'll just change platforms and there's an opportunity to sign up to speak for 2 minutes to share your opinions about this topic. You can also do that during this program. We just know that you're not going to have all the time that you're necessarily going to want for that. So over the next 45 minutes, we're going to be talking with the co-chairs of the task force, North Carolina Supreme Court Associate Justice Anita Earls and State Attorney General Josh Stein. Welcome to both of you and thank you for being on the program.
Thank you for having us.
Leslie, looking forward to the conversation.
Well, let's get started. We've got 45 minutes and a lot of questions to get through. So let me begin with just a personal question for you both. It's May 25th and George Floyd is killed in police custody. Police officers are charged with murder. What do you remember about the first time that you saw that video and maybe what's changed about your perspective over the past couple of months? Justice Earls, could you start?
Well, yeah, so I did see the video on TV and was just saddened, deeply sad. I mean, it brought tears to my eyes, and it came on the heels of other Black people being killed in really awful circumstances. So Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and it just felt overwhelming in terms of just the pain that I felt for all of us, for the families, but really for all of us.
General Stein?
For me, I saw it first on Twitter, and if you're scrolling through Twitter, you see an image and then you see an image and then there's a video, and I started watching it, and I'll be honest with you, I've not watched the whole thing yet because it's so horrifying and inhuman, like just the callousness with which the officer expired Mr. Floyd's life. And so I felt anger and fury and depression and sadness and like Anita said, it came in the context of other people having been killed recently at the hands of law enforcement. And, anytime any person's life is taken, it's tragic. But, it's especially problematic when it's done by someone whom we empower to have control over our bodies. I mean, we give authority to law enforcement to keep us safe and protect the peace. And so, it is very distressing.
It's ignited a series of consistent protests across the country. And in one of the tributes to John Lewis over the weekend I read, someone compared it on some level to Bloody Sunday in that it is an event that everyone was able to see and resonated in some kind of way that perhaps a lot of people hadn't gotten the attention of a lot of people. And now we're seeing a period of sustained protests. So it's not a weekend, it's not even a week, it's a month and 2 months. And that energy continues and the outrage continues. And wondering, what do you think's different this time? As Justice Earls mentioned, it's not like this hasn't been happening for a long time. What has changed in this moment that is causing this sort of sustained response instead of episodic response?
I think comparing it to Bloody Sunday actually has some resonance, because part of what was so impactful of that day in Selma was that the whole country saw it. Black people in the South had known that they would be met with violence by law enforcement if they were marching for their rights. And it's another thing when the whole country sees it. And I think that many Black people know that they've not been treated equitably by law enforcement or by the criminal justice system as a whole. And I think it's just something that really hit all of Americans smack dab in the face, to actually have to watch it and watch the callousness with which that officer acted. And so I do think it's changed the way Americans are considering this issue. I think there's a newfound recognition of the truth that Blacks aren't treated the same as whites in our criminal justice system. And so, and frankly, it gives me a little bit of hope that this time is going to be different, and that we can actually meet this moment and advance policies here in North Carolina to make things better for everybody.
Justice Earls, you've been working on social justice issues for most of your career, a lot of times in the quiet when you've been trying to make noise and people haven't been listening. What do you think's different this time?
Well, so I think the George Floyd's death has also been compared to the impact that Emmett Till's death had, a similar situation where the brutality and the callousness of someone's murder was made so publicly known. And I think the difference is both the breadth. So we had demonstrations in this country, across the country, even in North Carolina. The New York Times did an exhaustive look at all the places. I think this was published in mid-June, of all the places where demonstrations had happened. And it was like over 40 counties in North Carolina had demonstrations. And I also think the diversity of the people demonstrating is notable. And I think that it would be a mistake to think that these were all necessarily just spontaneous. I think there has been organizing around the Black Lives Matter movement since Ferguson and earlier. And so we are seeing protests with a fairly sophisticated public policy agenda sort of behind them. And I think the real question is, will we be able to translate these demands for change, which I think go beyond the criminal justice system and go towards really society as a whole? Are we going to address what we know is the impact of implicit racial bias throughout our society? Are we going to rise to the occasion and address these issues? So I do think we are living in a very extraordinary time.
You've got, just on the equity and law enforcement side, you've got a monumental challenge ahead of you, a report due by December 1st, and a fascinating coalition of people who are on this task force. You've got people from police departments, from sheriff's departments, you've got public defenders, you've got judges, you've got victims advocates, the General Assembly, formerly justice involved people, all charged with coming up with a report of some meaning, with some sort of recommendations in just a small period of time. And you're looking at a pretty wide scope of things. You're looking at some things that have to do with crime prevention, others that have to do with how arrests are made, others that have to do with how we set bail, the length of sentences, and on some level, even the back end of how sentences are handed down. That's a lot. How do you bring together that kind of coalition and take on that range of issues and have it be meaningful in a short period of time?
Leslie, now I'm not sure we should have done this thing. No, I have optimism. I have optimism for a few reasons. One is, we live in divided times, exceptionally partisan times, where if one side takes one position, the other side reflexively takes the other. And we've seen it as relates to a public health basic step like mask wearing. So we are in a weird moment. But one issue in the recent years where Republicans and Democrats have been able to work together is on criminal justice reform. And so I think that there's sort of a widespread consensus and a willingness to work across the aisle to get things done. You did a good job describing the diversity of perspectives that are on this task force. And frankly, all of those perspectives are necessary because they each have an important role to play in how the criminal justice system works. We've had 2 meetings so far, and already in the second meeting, this broad-based group has come to a clear consensus on 3 reforms. We've come up with 2 applying to policing and 1 applying to the courts. The one on policing is a ban on chokeholds, like what was used to kill Mr. Floyd, a duty to intervene and report, which those 3 other officers failed to do to help Mr. Floyd. And then for the courts, for a recommendation for a rule for the Supreme Court to adopt that judges take into account a person's ability to pay before instituting a fee or a fine, so that we're not criminalizing poverty. We're not putting people in prison because they're poor. So we've actually taken steps. Now, those are just preliminary steps, and there's many, like you said, you described the whole array of things we need to work on. And it's going to be a big task, but we're committed to doing it. We're meeting every 2 weeks until the end of this year. And the whole purpose is to come up with an effective, comprehensive list that will make a difference that can be implemented.
One of the things that you've been working on so far is establishing kind of a common vocabulary, a common understanding of racial justice related issues, and seeing a common set of data. And I just wanted to show some of the data that the task force has been seeing on a national level. You're also starting to get into some North Carolina level data. So first, on the sort of the front side of law enforcement, these are national data here. Blacks are twice as likely to be pulled over for a traffic stop. You've heard during your meetings that those national data are also true in just a couple of municipalities in North Carolina. I'm sure there is eventually going to be data available for all of those, but in Greensboro and Asheboro, the numbers are the same. Blacks are twice as likely to be pulled over for a traffic stop. You heard that Blacks are 2.5 times more likely to be killed by law enforcement than white men. Black women, 1.4 times more likely to be killed by law enforcement than white women. When it comes to sentencing, some, to me, shocking data. Blacks are receiving 20% longer sentences than whites when convicted for the same crime. Some testimony from a law professor at Wake Forest Law School that while Blacks make up 13% of the national population, they receive 57% of the life without parole sentences. And in prison, Blacks are 5.9 times more likely to be incarcerated than whites. Latinx community members, 3.1 times more likely to be incarcerated, and Black women twice as likely to be incarcerated compared to white women. So then you look at the overall prison population, and you see that the prison population is disproportionately African American, and that Hispanics are imprisoned at twice the rate of their actual makeup of the population. So a lot of that detail is out there. And Justice Earl, as I mentioned earlier, you've been working on civil rights and social justice in your career as a private attorney. And one of the charges for this group is to think about sentencing in an important way. We just saw some of the information about sentencing, and a lot of those decisions are made by judges. What can you say about sentencing as part of this task force that would make a meaningful difference?
Well, I think that there has been a number of efforts, both in North Carolina and across the country, to address racial disparities and racially disparate outcomes in sentencing. So I would point in North Carolina to the Race Matters for Juvenile Justice initiative in Mecklenburg County, and there their goal was to eliminate racial disparities in the juvenile justice system, but it was really sponsored by and initiated by judges in Mecklenburg County, who saw two defendants coming before them, one white, one black, and yet the recommendations were very disparate in terms of the outcomes that should happen for those juveniles. And so a large part of that effort is to recognize the impact of implicit racial bias and to give judges the tools that they need to counteract that. I think that training on implicit racial bias and some of the tools that have been developed to counteract that amongst judges is just one of many policy options that I think exist to try to address the issue. I'll just say one other big part of it is being aware of the data and measuring it. You can't manage something if you don't measure it. I think putting in place systems that will measure and monitor racial outcomes in the criminal justice system will go a long way towards getting us closer to equal justice.
So I don't want to put words in your mouth, but if judges were aware that sentencing decisions were going to become public record and would be evaluated based on some sort of fairness standard, they might behave differently?
I think that their awareness would cause them to question and be more careful in their sentencing decisions. So, for example, there have also been studies that judges actually give out more time at the end of the day. Like there's something now, a phenomenon called decision fatigue. And by the end of the day, they are tired. They have had to make a lot of decisions with not a lot of information in a very short period of time. And so that doesn't mean we should only have court in the mornings, but I think it means being aware of those kinds of factors can help counteract them.
That actually makes sense. When I was a teacher, I would find that when I went through a stack of papers to grade, that the grades at the end were much more generous than the grades at the beginning. So I would always go back and do the first 5 to 10 again to make sure that my standard of evaluation was equal among them. So I hadn't heard that, Anita, about the afternoon, but it makes sense.
General Stein, one of the interesting elements that came out of your last meeting was a piece of data that suggested that overall in the country, people who are in racial and ethnic minorities are underrepresented by roughly 24 points in the police forces and the sheriff's departments of our state and nation. And one of the suggestions is that if those communities were represented in greater numbers on the police forces, that law enforcement might play out differently. But in the near term, given that whites are disproportionately represented in most police departments, what kind of training can happen? We heard from Tony Godwin a few weeks ago, the former Cary police chief, who talked about the importance of careful recruitment of people and then all the training that had been done. But there's a lot of training that's been happening across our country, and we're still seeing outcomes like the ones we've been seeing over the past few months and the past few years. To what extent can training make a difference? And is that something that the task force is going to speak to?
Training is very important. And I also agree with the Cary police chief that I think it really does start at recruiting as well, because you want to recruit the right personality types into law enforcement. When law enforcement is such a public-spirited profession, you're trying to help people, and two kind of personality types tend to be attracted: either the guardian, the protector, I want to keep people safe, or the warrior, the person who wants to crash into things and fix things in a hard way. And clearly, we're better served, I think, when we have a lot more of the guardian than the warrior. And so recruiting and making sure you get the right people in on the front end is very important. And a lot of that has to do with how much we pay law enforcement. I frankly think we need to pay law enforcement more to make it a more attractive profession. But it's also what we ask law enforcement to do. If we overwhelm them with duties that are beyond the realm of any reasonable person, we're not only asking them to be peace officers, but we're asking them to be drug counselors or social workers or mental health crisis interveners. Like this is too much to put on the shoulders of any one person, in my view. So recruiting and getting the right people in is critically important, and making sure that those forces reflect the diversity of the communities they serve is critically important, but training is also important. We have requirements of more than 600 hours of basic law enforcement education in order to be initially certified as a law enforcement officer. And then every year, to maintain that certification, you have to do in-service training of another at least 24 hours, but most officers do more than that minimum. And in both the basic law enforcement training and in the mandated in-service, we are constantly revising the curriculum to address what is going on at the moment. And so this notion of implicit bias and that is part of the curriculum, trying to de-escalate situations rather than to bring greater stress to a situation. That is part of the curriculum. How to manage crowds is part of the curriculum. And so we're constantly trying to identify how do we improve what we're teaching to law enforcement so that they can be more successful in carrying out their very, very important responsibilities. At the Department of Justice, we have both the Training and Standards Commissions, which set the standards, and we have the North Carolina Justice Academy, which trains law enforcement. And so this is critically important work that we do at the Department of Justice, but we recognize that you're never done. You've never finished the curriculum. You've never finished understanding what needs to be done to help educate the best law enforcement possible. So that is absolutely part of the agenda of what we're going to be doing on our task force, is looking hard at what the courses are, what the training are, what we need to do better, so that we can try to make our system work fairer for more people.
Comment in the chat that picks up on part of what you said, basically saying that law enforcement's mandate has grown so large that it's almost impossible to keep up with all the things that someone is responsible for, as the person says, responding to almost any conceivable public problem or nuisance. So how do you keep up training when the mandate is that large, or is the mandate too large and we need to shrink it? And if so, how do we need to shrink it?
Well, I think we need to reimagine how we keep the public safe, so that if someone calls 911 and says, my son is having a mental health episode and I fear for my safety or my neighbor's safety, the police may not be the right group to go out and intervene. Maybe it's better to have a mental health counselor who can respond to that 911 call, who has the training on how to deal with a person in crisis. And maybe the police needed to go to in case somebody's physical harm someone is at risk. But same thing with a drug overdose. Maybe the best person to go to there is a drug counselor in addition to the police. And so I think that rethinking how we respond to crises is an important part. I talked with the African-American chief of police in an eastern North Carolina town who was very desperately trying to recruit more African-American officers to his department. And he said that he was having real challenges and identified a few factors. One, pay. Two was the breadth of responsibilities we place on them. And then three, it's almost because we ask so much of them, and we ask so much of the criminal justice system to sort of be the repository of all of our social problems, whether it's mental health or addiction or whatever, that the community is upset with the way the police department is engaging with them, really through the fault of government for failing to create a system that effectively deals with these widespread problems. And that young African Americans just didn't want to go there. It was something that was not an appealing career option for them. And so we have a lot of work to do, but I kind of feel like it all fits together, that if we can reimagine this public safety, if we can get really good people in law enforcement, we can adequately and appropriately train them, then all of a sudden the community starts to have more faith in it, and it becomes a more attractive profession. And that's where we're trying to get, is create that virtuous cycle here in North Carolina.
Justice Earls, a couple of comments in the chat about freeing the inmates, and that may be a little bit beyond the purview of this particular task force, but in this immediate moment, a lot of concern about prisons and jails being breeding grounds for COVID-19. I don't know if these numbers are correct, so I'm not going to quote them specifically, but in Lumberton, someone's saying there are a huge number of people who are infected, some who are hospitalized, some who are going to die, guards overwhelmed. Is there anything that can happen in the near term to make our prisons safer, just in terms of not being breeding grounds for COVID-19?
Right. Well, so I can say that Secretary Hooks is a member of the task force. That this question has come before the Supreme Court and has the potential to come back before the court. So I personally can't comment at this stage. But I will, what I can say, if I can talk about police training for just a minute, because I think the piece we're missing is accountability. Right, and there are numerous mechanisms for accountability, but Judge Wynn of Jim Wynn on the Fourth Circuit has written an article about how our legal doctrine, by expanding the concept of qualified immunity, has essentially fallen down in the task of holding police officers accountable when they do violate someone's rights by using excessive force. So there's accountability within the justice system, whether it's civil justice or criminal justice. But there are also mechanisms like civilian review boards that are an attempt, I think, to add a layer of accountability to police action. So I think it would be a mistake not to mention that in addition to training, we really should be looking at accountability structures.
Ask you about something you mentioned earlier that has really stuck in the craw of a lot of people for a long time, and that is the bonds that come up when somebody is in a pretrial setting. And one of the challenges is that some people can afford to put up money for the bonds and others can't. Those that can't end up going to jail. That then sends them into a spiral where perhaps they lose their job or they otherwise are not able to proceed. And that one thing, the pretrial bond, ends up creating this cascade of effects that effectively sends them down a hole, whether they end up being convicted for whatever they're charged with or not. Is there anything that could be done about that? And what's the task force looking at when it comes to these bonds?
That is definitely one of the topics. So we've divided the task force into 4 work groups, and in addition to our public hearing, the other steps will be for the working groups to meet, and the issue of pretrial release and bonds is on the agenda for one of those working groups. Our state statute, unlike other states, is actually fairly explicit and clear that money bonds should not be the first method of ensuring that someone comes back for their trial. And so there are definitely proposals that have been studied prior to this task force being created. There have definitely been efforts to look at how to better enforce North Carolina's statute equally across the state, because some of the data I think will show that the experience is different in different parts of the state. So whether or not you get a bond and how much it is might depend on where you are arrested in the state. So there's a lot of disparities I think that we need to address, but I feel like we have the capacity to do that even without necessarily changing state law. So there are important ways that we can make more uniform what happens across the state, and make it true that we no longer have people in jail on nonviolent misdemeanor offenses simply because they can't post a $500 bond.
Leslie, just to follow up on that, I agree with 100% of what Justice Earls just said. And it's actually been an issue that my office has been working on for the past year and a half. Because I traveled around the state and met with a number of the people doing this pretrial work. Oftentimes they're county employees, and their job is to assess somebody before they have their first appearance. And it's determined, is bail set? What are the pretrial conditions? Are there financial conditions? Are there non-financial conditions? Is it released on their own personal recognizance? All of that. And a number of counties are doing quite a good job on this in North Carolina. And so what I have done is I've organized a series of 4 or 5 regional, one major statewide conference, and then a series of regional conferences where we've pulled together the actors in the criminal justice system that have been doing a lot of work on this to come talk to other actors in the criminal justice system, which may not have as many resources as they do or much experience with that issue, so that they can learn from each other. Because the one certainty is that when people's liberty is deprived, if we lock people up before they've been convicted, they've been arrested, but they haven't been convicted, it should be, in fact, the law declares it must be, because they pose a risk to hurt somebody or to not appear for their trial. It should not be because they're poor. And too many people are in our county jails. The vast majority of people in jail today have not been convicted of the crime for which they've been arrested. They're waiting their trial. If they are going to be detained, it should be because they pose a societal risk, not because they're poor. And we're going to move. That is absolutely one of the issues that this task force is going to wrestle with.
One of the numbers I saw from your last meeting is 94% of misdemeanors and 83% of felony crimes are non-violence. They don't involve physical violence. So overwhelming percentage of those are not, would not appear to be generating imminent danger to their community. They're non-violent offenses.
Yes, and there's all kinds of data that shows that the longer you detain somebody after they've been arrested, but before they've been tried, this is completely upside down from the way most people think about it. They're like, well, we have to detain them to keep us safe. The longer you detain somebody before their trial, the more likely it is they will commit crimes in the future. Now, why is that? Well, if they're in jail for 3 days or 5 days, what happens to their job? They lose their job. They failed to show up for their job. What happens if they lose their job? They lose their source of income. They may face eviction. Their entire life can spiral out of control simply because of a discretionary decision to put a financial condition on somebody's release. When there are wonderful studies from the School of Government, the Institute of Government at UNC, where they've compared different methodologies on how you deal with this. And the likelihood of somebody appearing at their trial date is almost exactly the same, whether you release them after they've been arrested or whether you detain them. And so we should be striving to make our community safer and help people have successful lives rather than the opposite.
When you hear the words defund the police, what do you think? What's your reaction to that? And what does that mean to you? And how might that figure into the deliberations of the task force?
I addressed some of this concept in my earlier comments, but I think the real challenge is to reimagine public safety. Like, what is the best way to keep people safe, to use our public resources? And I think that we put way too much on officers. And by the way, if you look at mental health measurements of law enforcement, it is one of the most stressful jobs in our society, with people really struggling with mental health challenges because of the demands we place on them. And then, of course, we don't, as a society, do a particularly good job helping people who have mental health challenges. So I think we should be having drug counselors respond to drug crises, mental health counselors respond to mental health crises, social workers for a lot of family crisis where there's no violence involved. So I think that's one thing, but I think we need to invest more in law enforcement so that we can actually pay these officers a decent wage to make it a more attractive job for public spirited people. And so I think it's about reimagining and actually investing more in select ways.
Justice Earls, two of the working groups that the task force has, one is focused on the courts and sort of charging decisions made about how someone might be charged in a particular case, and the other, another is focused on post-conviction. Can you talk about any promising ideas you've heard in either of those areas that you think might be something that the task force would consider?
So on the charging decisions issue, I think we've seen in recent, we elected our district attorneys in North Carolina, and we have recently seen district attorneys running on exploring these issues in a way that suggests they also want to look at how their offices operate and ensuring that there's racial equity in how they conduct their operations. So I think that reviewing whether or not they are making charging decisions in a way that's fair to every person that becomes involved in the criminal justice system, I think that's already on the agenda of some district attorneys across the state, and that there are incentives that the task force can recommend to try to address that. And in some way, I think there are some promising models from other parts of the country, from other states. North Carolina is not the only state that faces these racial disparities in its criminal justice system, and this is not the first time we've been aware of the issue. On the question of post-sentence, this is an area where the legislature recently has already acted, and so that's on the question of the collateral consequences of a conviction. There are so many right now barriers to everything from renting an apartment to getting a job to furthering your education that accompany a criminal conviction, and the legislature has taken action to make it easier to get expunctions in some cases, and to pull back on some of those barriers. There has also been a lot of work amongst attorneys to represent people to get convictions cleared from their record. And it's really stunning the way that this can follow someone for 20, 30, the rest of their lives. And when you remove that barrier, it just opens up opportunities for employment, for people to support their families, for those families to contribute to their communities. It has a ripple effect. So I think looking at the whole question of the collateral consequences of convictions and seeing where there might be consensus across party lines to grant greater relief in those circumstances, I think is another promising avenue.
In between the charging and the post conviction is the sentencing, and we saw earlier some of the differential sentencing outcomes that we have depending on your race. What can be done there? Is there anything that can be done? In most cases, those decisions I think are made by judges, although there are legal guidelines that they're following.
Well, and the state did many, I guess it's many years ago now, revamp its sentencing statutes, and I think that you go back and forth between, is more discretion better because a judge can tailor the sentence to the circumstances of each individual crime and each individual offender, or is less discretion better because then you get more uniform treatment based on the crime? I think there's debates on which is better, but this task force is charged with looking at racial equity. Are we treating people the same based on race? And there, I think that whether you have judges with more discretion or less discretion, you can definitely look at data and assess where in the state are judges appearing to be more fair and where are they less fair. At the end of the day, I would say it's up to the voters, because we also elect judges. And if I would just say, observing how our politics have gone in the past, the demand from voters has been for judges who are, going to be strict and impose harsh sentences. And we've seen, or there's been a political move to be harsh on crime. And what I think one of the impacts of understanding that George Floyd's death was not an isolated event, and that racial disparities exist throughout our criminal justice system, hopefully is also an understanding that the over-criminalization in our society and that locking people up for long periods of time is actually not good for us on a number of levels, might lead to voters asking judges to exercise their discretion in a different way.
And just to build on what Justice Earl said, and incorporating something she said earlier, if we measure this and we actually readily know which judges are doing what in terms of how they conduct or issue sentences based on similar set of facts, I think that's good for a number of reasons. There's explicit bias and there's implicit bias. Explicit bias is where somebody acts intentionally to achieve an outcome that is discriminatory. Implicit bias is when people do these things and they're not even really aware of it because they've somehow been it's so internalized into how they see the world that they're unaware. And so putting the data in front of judges so that they themselves can see the sentencing disparity, I think that in and of itself is an incredibly positive and healthy thing, because I think a lot of judges will then really consciously work hard to address that and make sure it doesn't happen. And to the extent they don't, then, as Justice Earl said, the voters always have the final word here in North Carolina.
So both of you are charged with leading this task force. As I mentioned earlier, it's a pretty big range of people who are on the task force, and there are people who don't necessarily instinctively agree about the extent to which law enforcement is punishment versus chance for rehabilitation. There's going to be a range of opinion, and I'm wondering what your strategy is to find consensus among this group.
Well, I think one thing is to just make sure we have a shared set of data so that we all know what the facts are, and that will help inform whether, I mean, first we have to agree that there needs to be a policy response. And then when you have the data, you can then argue what is the appropriate policy response. And I think we will have a lot of, I was thinking verbal wrestling, just debate, discussion, and disagreement. I don't want to doubt that there will not be disagreement, but the group has already demonstrated, even though, I mean, we so wish we could be in person where you develop relationships, camaraderie, you're at the coffee pot together, you start to get to know people a little better. We're missing out on a lot of that because of having to do it through technology. But the fact that we, in our second meeting, were able to make 3 important reform recommendations, I think is very encouraging, a very encouraging development. It doesn't mean that everyone's going to agree on every recommendation going forward, but there was genuine consensus that these were 3 very good ideas, appropriate ideas that can actually potentially save lives here in North Carolina. And so I'm encouraged. I'm not Pollyanna-ish about it. I know we will have challenges along the way, but these are all people of exceptionally good faith who want our criminal justice system to work as well as it possibly can. Justice is supposed to be blind, that the words chiseled on the face of the U.S. Supreme Court building are equal justice under law. These are core principles of our democracy. And so anyone who's engaged wants that to be true, wants it to be real. And that's what we're working to try to get toward.
Justice Earls, can you talk about the process from a public standpoint? How do people make their voices heard? And we've got a little bit of a summary that shows people how to go to the public hearing you guys are about to have. Can you just talk a little bit about the process over the next few months and how the public might be able to participate in it?
Yeah, so in addition to today's public hearing, there will be a couple of others, including one in the evening, so people who can't make it during the day can participate that way. That's only 2 minutes to speak. We have a web portal that at the ncdoj.gov/TREC, TREC website is also a link for a place to submit written comments. And even, if people don't have internet access, mailing material, I have already received things at the court. So we definitely want to make this accessible to people no matter how they can communicate. And I think we will also be having some listening sessions that are regional, so that we can hear from different parts of the state as well. So there are a lot of opportunities to both give us initial comments on what issues we should address, but then as we begin to develop recommendations, we'll be seeking feedback on those.
All right, Justice Anita Earls and Attorney General Josh Stein, thank you so much for being with us. They're not going away, not leaving the public eye. They're just migrating platforms. So we just showed the place that you can go to sign up for the public comment period. That is available to you. Just go to nccourts.gov if you'd like to say something, and you can find out more about that public comment period. There will also be other opportunities, as Justice Earls mentioned, on September 4th and October 16th for you to comment on what your opinions are and to listen in on the recommendations of the task force. So thanks to both Justice Earls and to General Stein for being with us, and you can see them in 14 minutes on this on the website that we gave you. We're going to be back at our regular time. We're now on every other Thursday, this coming Thursday at 9 a.m. So 2 days from now, guest host Pat Cronin will be back with the second in his series looking at child care in North Carolina, what's changing as a result of COVID, with his guests, Sheila Arias from Moms Rising, Marcia Basho, the Child Care Services Association, Rhonda Rivers with Leaf Spring Schools in Charlotte, and Seppi Saidi, who's the president and CEO of Seppi Inc. All these shows sponsored by the Duke Endowment. We hope that you will turn in for that. If you would like to, just a quick correction from DOJ, at this point, it's late enough that if you would like to speak today, the registration is officially closed, but if you will reach out to Ellen Spolar, and her email address is espolar@ncdoj.gov. So if you'd like to speak today, the registration is officially closed. If you reach out to her, she's going to try to work you again. Again, that's espolar@ncdoj.gov if you'd like to speak at the public hearing today. Thanks to Jasmine for sharing that information with us. So that is our show for today. First and Future is produced by Greg Hedgepath. If you enjoyed the show, we hope you'll tell a friend. There's going to be a recording of it put up on our website late today, both an audio and a video version on our website, emergingissues.org/podcast. Thanks today to Simone Kallman for research. Renee Potts does our slides. Kirsten Chang does our webinar summaries and keeps the chat going. I'm Leslie Boney for all of us at the Institute for Emerging Issues at NC State. Thanks for joining us. Stay safe and see you in the future.